Well, all right, boys and girls, well, here we are. We have come to the collapse of the Soviet Union and how the Cold War is finally won. I guess the beginning of that story is the unraveling of the period of time known as détente. So in 1980, President Ronald Reagan is going to be elected in the United States. The year or two before that, Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, had kind of brought back Soviet militarism with the invasion of Afghanistan, which turns out to be the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is a tremendous misfire on behalf of the USSR. They spend so many men and so much money fighting that war that it severely weakens the Soviet economy. They met a very spirited resistance from the rebel groups, many of which were militantly Islamic in nature. In particular, there was a group known as the Mujahideen. And they were a group of fighters that came from the Middle East, many of them born in Saudi Arabia. And they began to take up arms and fight against the Soviet Union. Mujahideen, basically, you might hear the word jihad in that. It literally meant holy warriors. And they considered it a crusade for Islamic civilization against, this conquering Russian power. Incidentally, one of the main leaders of the Mujahideen is a fellow by the name of Osama bin Laden. Perhaps you have heard of him. What you might not know about Osama bin Laden is that Osama bin Laden was given tremendous amounts of money in armament by the United States government, because we considered, we had this idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so we gave Osama bin Laden lots of money and arms to fight the Russians with, and then at the end of the Russian-Afghan war, the little son of a gun turns him against us. And we'll talk about how that goes, later on as well. This is actually a little bit of a pattern. The United States has some interesting questions to ask about how we handle some of the Cold War stuff. So we always were kind of like trying to pick. We've had this tendency of wanting to kind of pick potential opponents or to pick people to work against our current opponents that then become our future opponents. So in the same way, we gave arms and stuff to Saddam Hussein's Iraq because he was at war with Iran in the 1980s, and then Saddam turns around and becomes our a major enemy of ours in the 90s and 2000s. And then obviously what we had, the Russians against the Germans. So this is actually kind of a trap we've fallen into several times. One thing I haven't really taken the time to comment on, that the United States did have a few interesting kind of ethical questions to ask about how we fight the Cold War, because I do believe that there is a moral component to what we were trying to do. A lot of the Cold War was motivated around we saw communism as evil and wanted to get rid of it, but at the same time, sometimes the best way to work against the interest of the Soviet Union involved supporting dictators who were not communists, but also were still dictators. And this is a dilemma we faced a lot in Latin America in particular. And typically, so President Truman, was one of the first presidents to have to answer this question. And he had a saying, and people would ask him, why would you support this such and such a person? And he would say, well, I may be a son of a gun. He may be a son of a gun, but he's our son of a gun. And so the idea being, sometimes, you just have to make certain compromises to work against, the interest of the Soviet Union. So this was one of those times. I would say we may not have liked the Mujahideen. We may not have realized just how dangerous the Mujahideen movement would become, but we looked at them as like bravely trying to fight off communism. So we didn't really understand how bad the international jihad thing was going to get in the 90s and 2000s. So anyway, Reagan comes to power. The Soviets have once again shown themselves to still have an expansionistic and imperialistic bone. And so Reagan does a couple things to kind of get tough on the Soviets. One is he actually just tells the truth with his words. So Reagan steps up the rhetoric around the Soviet Union to another degree, which unnerved a lot of people that had gotten really attached to the peace movement and the SALT treaties and all this kind of stuff. Because a lot of them were like, "Stop me, man! You can't keep talking like that, or you'll kind of ruin all these treaties." But Reagan really knew what he was doing too. And so he would do things like call the USSR the evil empire, and talk about confining it to the ash heap of history. And this is language about the Soviet Union collapsing. He's using language about getting rid of the Soviet Union as a thing. No one was doing that during the détente period. So in some ways, Reagan's kind of resuming some of the more aggressive footing of the post-World War II presidents. The next thing he's going to do is, kind of pick up that kind of Truman Doctrine thing of preventing the spread of communism to other places. We fight a very short war. I don't even know if you'd call it a war because it was over within a period of just a few days. But we committed troops to, there's a small Caribbean island nation known as Grenada, and communists overthrew the Grenadian government. America sent troops in and overthrew that communist regime, brought the old government back. I mean, within a days. I mean, it was like less than a week that we won this, this really, really short war. This was a little more controversial because there was a scandal involved in the funding. We'll talk about that more next year in American history. But Reagan was involved in sending money to the Contras, who were an anti-communist guerrilla movement in Nicaragua that was fighting the Sandinistas, which was the Nicaraguan communist regime. Reagan generally funds and supports anti-communist movements all across the world, including the Mujahideen. Another thing that he does is he kind of starts an arms spending race in a way that the Soviets were unable to keep up. So Reagan actually, some people have this image of Reagan that he was, incredibly hawkish and would have loved to have gone to war. That's not really true. He actually was a believer in nuclear disarmament. The problem was he did not think that the Soviet Union was really trustworthy, and he wanted to kind of withhold doing anything on that front until they showed some signs of being a more trustworthy partner on some of this stuff. And one thing that he does, he greatly expands spending on national defense. One of the things, next year, we kind of skipped over domestic policy in American history just for the sake of time. We'll talk about it in great detail next year. One of the things that makes Reagan special in American history is how much he's able to turn the economy around with a really massive tax cut and some stuff like that. But along with that, he also greatly expanded spending on our military and intelligence capabilities. And so we have kind of a strengthened military. And with that, he announces a program called the Strategic Defense Initiative. Its critics called it the Star Wars program because that movie had just come out fairly recently. And they were saying it was unrealistic, this is science fiction, this can't be done. But Reagan insisted that yes, it could be done. And the idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative is to come up with a missile defense technology that could shoot a Soviet missile out of the sky over America, so that if the Soviets sent out a missile, that we could intercept it with another missile and take it out. And they were going to use he envisioned lasers and all sorts of things being used in this. Some of this technology just never materialized. We just never figured out how to do it. However, we did make some strides towards that goal. And it's probable that we do have some sort of missile intercept technologies. I know Israel famously invented a missile intercept system known as the Iron Dome that has actually worked on several occasions where missiles have been shot out of the sky. So I'm sure that we have some of that capability, although much of it is classified. Regardless of how far the SDI went, some of his, domestic political opponents in the Democratic Party were skeptical and treated the SDI as a joke or unrealistic, but the Soviet leaders did not. They understood that this is a real danger. They had watched America figure out a way to, land a man on the moon just, 10 or 12 years earlier, when we had became, the Russians actually were the first people to put a satellite in space, the so-called Sputnik satellite. A Russian man by the name of Yuri Gagarin, a Russian cosmonaut is what they called him over there. We'd call them astronauts here. Yuri Gagarin becomes the first person in orbit, but it's the United States with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and so on that becomes the first country to actually put people physically walking on the moon. I want to say it was 1969. So the Russians are convinced that this SDI is a very real possibility, and they want to try to develop their own capability to either match or exceed it, or to figure out a way around said defenses. And they start spending tons of money on defense, in addition to the amount of money they were already spending with this costly Afghan war that had turned into a quagmire. And so what this turns into is the Russians just spending god-awful amounts of money while their economy sucks because of communism. And it brings the Soviet Union to the brink of economic collapse. And finally, the Soviets get to a place where it looks like the way they've been doing things won't hold up. The Soviets had a little bit of a leadership crisis in the early 80s. Brezhnev dies as a very old man in 82. And basically the way the Russians did things, they just kind of picked the next man up. But the next man up in all these cases, it was several consecutive leaders who were like 75, 80 years old when they took, well, not quite 80, but they were like in their 70s when they took power. And many of them died quickly. So the Soviets had presidents die in 2 consecutive years, in 82, 83, or 83, 84. So, in Reagan's 4 years in office, he had 4 Soviet counterparts, which made it hard to get any kind of peace talks done because they would die on him all the time. And so Reagan, famously, made a comment about, I don't know how to negotiate with these people. They keep dying on me. So they finally turned to a younger fellow to lead the party in 84, a man by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. I wish... maybe look in your textbook and see if they have a picture of Mikhail Gorbachev, because he's got this he was bald, and he has this very distinctive birthmark on his head that looks like a state. Like he's got like this really weird print on his head. One day when I was in high school, this is a random trivia fact, when I was in high school, the school I went to had been founded in the 80s, and so they had a 20th anniversary while I was there, and so for Spirit Week they did an 80s Day, and for 80s Day I went as Mikhail Gorbachev, and I wore a suit and talked in a Russian accent, and I put like a bald cap on my head and drew the birthmark, and walked around calling everyone comrade all day. It was kind of funny. But anyway, so Gorbachev comes in, and he is a little bit of a reformer. He realizes that the way the Soviets have been doing things is not going to hold up. And if he's going to save communism from losing to the capitalist pigs, he's going to have to embrace a little bit about that piggish capitalism. And so Gorbachev winds up kind of moderating the Soviet Union to a degree. There were 2 kind of parts to Gorbachev's platform. One is called Glasnost, and one is Perestroika. You don't have to spell Perestroika. It's a really complicated word. It's actually kind of how it sounds, but nonetheless. Basically, Glasnost was the idea of openness. One thing, so they opened up just a little more free discussion. They allowed reporters to actually find out about problems and write bad stories about party officials involved in the problems. To a degree. We'll talk about the Chernobyl thing maybe if we have time. So that they still covered some stuff up. But they allowed like a little bit of media accountability. They allowed more dissidents. They let a lot of political prisoners out of prison. They actually allowed churches to open up and start operating freely again. Especially Eastern Orthodox churches. I think some of the Protestant churches might have still. I'm not sure if they let all of them open up right away. Excuse me. So they kind of open things up at a domestic level. Perestroika, so glasnost meant openness. Perestroika meant restructuring. And restructuring was about kind of changing the way that the Soviet system worked and in enabling aspects of markets, aspects of free enterprise. The government still regulated the economy very heavily, but they started to allow people to own more private property. In particular, they allowed people to start small businesses where they could keep, some of what they make doing these businesses. Allowed farmers to start. They went from the farming being a nationwide collective to like a little bit more local control. People started to be able to have like a little bit more in terms of private property and land rights and stuff like that. Not like they didn't end communism overnight. Now, don't get me wrong. There was still a lot of government control. But they kind of started to allow a little bit more freedom. And they even started to create a situation where people could even start electing representatives that could have a little bit more actual influence in politics at the level of each of the different republics within the Soviet Union, which would be like the equivalent today, I guess, of having a little more freer elections at like the State House of Delegates level or something. So the Soviet Union, cracks the door ajar for freedom, and Gorbachev's thought process is that he doesn't want the Soviet Union to die, and he doesn't want communism to die because he's still a communist, but he does think that they have to inject enough democracy into the system to keep it from collapsing completely. So the problem for Gorbachev is, and which winds up being a good thing for society, is that just the way the winds of freedom were starting to blow through Eastern Europe, opening things up a little bit was going to encourage people to just knock the doors down. We'll talk in the next lesson that we'll look at on Monday. We'll look at what was going on in the other Eastern European countries at this time. But it's important to know that for this purpose, it's important to know that in Poland, there had been a major movement out of communism towards democracy that was spearheaded by a labor union leader by the name of Lech Walesa, working in concert with President Reagan and the Pope, who was a Polish man, John Paul II. And the three of them really worked together to push for freedom in Poland. And Poland had actually, by 87, 88, Poland actually gets free from Soviet domination. And then there are some other countries in Eastern Europe during the time that either remained communist but pulled away from Soviet control, or started to abandon communism. So communism is slowly starting to unravel. There's pro-democracy movements kind of in the air. And so with the Russian government, so with the economic collapse and all the security challenges, the war, the arms race, all this stuff, more and more people are pushing for freedom in Eastern Europe. There's a watershed moment where President Reagan goes to East Germany. He goes to West Germany, but he makes a speech at the Berlin Wall, which was the greatest symbol of communist oppression that there was. And Reagan and Gorbachev actually became friends. As much as they could be in that situation. Reagan kind of felt like Gorbachev was someone who could be trusted to honor treaty obligations and things like that, which actually led to Reagan and Gorbachev hammering out some arms limitation treaties amongst each other. That kind of, that's something that you think of as being more characteristic of the détente period. But Reagan was actually able to work with Gorbachev, and Reagan, of course, he was famous for his sense of humor. And there's this, he actually told this joke to Mikhail Gorbachev's face at a meeting. They were having a meeting at one of these diplomatic summits, and Reagan said, have you heard the one about the difference between the Americans and the Soviets? He said, men's walking, an American and a Soviet are arguing over who has the greater country. And the American says, the United States of America is the greatest country in the world, because if I want to, I can make an appointment, I can walk into the White House, I can bang my fist on the president's desk and say, I don't like the way Ronald Reagan is running the United States. And so the Soviet man says, well, you know, oh, but you see, I too can make an appointment, walk into the Kremlin, which is the Soviet version of the White House. He said, I can walk into the Kremlin, I can make an appointment, walk into Gorbachev's desk, pound my fist on the table and say, I don't like the way Ronald Reagan is running the United States. So if you don't get the joke, it's because, you know, he couldn't complain about how he was running the Soviet Union, but he could complain about how Reagan was doing things over here. So Reagan and Gorbachev are able to actually work together. They have a little bit of a rapport, but Reagan makes this speech at the Brandenburg Gate, which is one of the main entrances there to the Berlin Wall, and he stands there and he makes a speech. Go watch the whole speech on YouTube. It's incredible. It's maybe the greatest speech that an American president has made. It's fantastic. But at one point in it, he talks about the signs of opening up of the Eastern Bloc, and he kind of talks about some of the movement toward democracy and some of the baby steps that Gorbachev had made towards new openness. And then basically he says, but Gorbachev, if you really mean, and his speechwriters fought him over this, they didn't want him to say this, but Reagan knew he had to say it. He gets up there and he says, you know, but Gorbachev, if you really mean what you've been saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And no one knew he was going to say that. It wasn't in his prepared speech. And you see this crowd of West German people when, oh, I'm getting fired up even talking about it. Reagan says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And that really reserved German crowd goes nuts cheering. And, you know, the public relations battle is being lost by the Soviet Union. People are turning against communism with great rapidity. And so Gorbachev, in his attempts to kind of, he decides to kind of save the system by weakening the system, but in reality, he probably accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, well, if you had to live under any Soviet ruler, you wouldn't have wanted to live under any of them, to be clear. If you had to live under one of them, you would have wanted it to be Gorbachev. But even with that, you know, Gorbachev probably made the bad decision from a pure, like, dictator's viewpoint. Because that little bit of freedom he let people taste, combined with the movements for independence in Poland and in East Germany and these different places, you know, it really kind of gets people ready to turn against the Communist Party. So what begins to happen, and I should say, too, that during this time period, Russia has a major problem with a nuclear power meltdown at a plant called Chernobyl in Russia that causes a major humanitarian disaster. And because all the communist bureaucrats wanted to cover their butt more than they wanted to keep people safe, they kept what happened top secret and led to a whole bunch of people getting killed from radiation poisoning. No similarities to current events at all. I'm just kidding. Lots of them, actually. But Gorbachev, you know, there's an incident where once Gorbachev allows more representation in the Soviet system, more and more of the other ethnicities besides the Russians want to get independence from the Soviet Union. Remember, they call it the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they claim to be, you know, 16 self-governing republics united together. It wasn't really quite like that. You know, Russia really controlled from the top down. But that, remember, Lenin had put that in way back in the day because he knew that within the land of what became the Soviet Union, you had all these different, you had Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia and Ukraine and, you know, all these different places that all had their own ethnic makeup and different religions and cultures and languages. So with that, a lot of these groups start calling for independence. And the first challenges came from the Baltic nations, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. And they were all countries that had been free, independent countries between the world wars. In 1990, Lithuania declares its independence. And Gorbachev originally, he's kind of in a tough spot because he doesn't want to ruin all of his newfound international respect by pulling a Khrushchev or a Brezhnev and just, you know, bringing the hammer down on Lithuania, but he also doesn't want to let them leave. So what he does, he starts by launching an economic blockade where no one's allowed to like trade with Lithuania. And he's afraid that anything harsher than that is going to cause other republics within the USSR to revolt as well. Ultimately, they don't back down because Gorbachev was not as feared as some of the other Soviets had been, and so what he winds up having to do is send troops. And so there are 14 people killed and several more wounded in the Soviets trying to regain control of the Lithuania situation. So again, this is a sign that Gorbachev may be a reformer, he may have been improving things, but he also is still a communist dictator and still does some communist dictator things from time to time, and this was one of them. So this is really the writing on the wall that things are starting to shift, but nobody really recognizes it yet. And the Soviet Union winds up collapsing well ahead of when anyone thought it would have happened. And that happens right around 1991. So in this case, a lot of the hardline communists, like the diehards, the ones that studied Marx and Lenin in their spare time, the ones that loved throwing people in gulags, the ones that missed the glory days of having the nation under an iron fist, a lot of them start to get frustrated with Gorbachev and blame him for allowing the Soviet Union to become weak. And Gorbachev is kind of forced into an unlikely alliance with someone who had been a political rival, a former mayor of Moscow, who then was serving in the legislature by the name of Boris Yeltsin. They both kind of were speaking against the communist hardliners. What winds up happening is 1991, the hardliners decide that they are going to overthrow Gorbachev and bring in a more iron-willed, Stalin-like, or at least Brezhnev-like ruler. And so they put Gorbachev on house arrest. He was at a vacation home on the coast. Soldiers show up, put guns to his head, and are trying to force him to resign. And then troops under the command of these communist hardliners send troops into Moscow to try to seize control of the capital and begin running the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin emerges as the leader of the opposition, and what's interesting is the people by now are so done with the Soviet Union and so done with the communist system that they basically stand up and refuse to comply, and Yeltsin standing up with them kind of gives them a little bit of confidence. Ultimately, finally, the hardliners, they actually order the Soviet army to fire. They say, to open up and to start attacking the protesters and so on. But the Soviet army by now has kind of caught the democracy fever too, and a lot of the soldiers literally refuse to follow orders and just refuse to go along with it. And then when that happens, one by one, each of the different republics of the Soviet Union starts declaring their independence from the USSR, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, all these different places, including, and this is really the death knell, Russia. Yeltsin gains control of Russia, and Russia declares independence from the Soviet Union. Well, once that happens, there's no more Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was Russia, basically. So, 1991, overnight, stunning the world. No one would have expected it. The Soviet Union completely collapses. The Cold War is over, and we won. Bye-bye, Soviet Union. However, the sad thing is, we'll just kind of walk you through Russian history up to the present. The sad thing is, the situation in Russia does not improve quite as much as people wanted. Yeltsin gets elected the first president of the new independent Russia. He tries an economic policy that he calls shock therapy, which is like just diving headlong into market capitalism. And it was just too much uncertainty and too much change too quickly. It causes some pretty severe economic problems. And also, there are some developments in Russia that create ways for a lot of like Russian underworld and like mafia type figures to gain outsized control, and a lot of what they call plutocrats are these kind of really rich people who were able to throw around a lot of influence. A lot of them start to gain undue influence in Russia. And so Russia does not immediately, and I wish I could tell you that after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia immediately became this wonderful haven of democracy and everyone singing Kumbaya. But unfortunately, they had their troubles. They start dealing with rebellion of some Islamic factions in Chechnya, which is a region of Russia. Yeltsin winds up becoming unpopular, and he gets ultimately he's replaced in 2000 by a man by the name of Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin has basically controlled Russia for the last 20 years. He's been president as long as he could be president, according to their new constitution. When he wasn't president, he would become prime minister, which they're two different jobs in the new Russian system. Either way, he was a former member of the KGB, which was the Soviet intelligence agency that was responsible for, Soviet espionage, including the secret police stuff at home. So he's a bad dude. He was, and he kind of, he's not a communist. He still allows free business, but he actually has some similarities with his KGB roots, and then also some connections to what you might call fascism. He's a little bit, he's certainly an authoritarian. He's certainly a dictator. He certainly doesn't allow a ton of freedom. There's still some journalists who talked bad about him who wound up dead. He's kind of led Russia backwards in some ways. You really at the 1991, you would have really hoped that the Russian people might be able to actually have some functioning freedom and prosperity for the first time in really forever. They've always had this very severe, authoritarian culture dating back to, being the last European power to really abandon absolute monarchy. They were abolishing feudalism around the time of the American Civil War. So unfortunately, democratic Russia never really emerged except for a few struggling years in the 90s. And Putin has kind of reasserted Russian aggression a little bit. They invaded the country of Georgia, not Georgia like Atlanta, Georgia, but there's a little country called Georgia, which is actually where Joseph Stalin was born. They invaded that country in 2006. They invaded Ukraine and took some land in the early 2010s. So, so Russia is once again a kind of country we kind of have some worries about. But we shall see what the future holds. But the Putin era doesn't look like it's ending anytime soon as of right now, and it's been going on about 20 years since. So anyway, so that's history in Russia up to the present day. We come back Monday, we'll look at how communism fell in the rest of Eastern Europe, and then we'll spend the rest of the week looking at the Middle East and how Israel gaining its independence, some of the wars in the Arab countries, and the way that the world built towards 9/11 and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and all that kind of stuff. So that should be fun to look at. So y'all have yourselves a good weekend.